year was 1776. Delegates from the 13 colonies convened in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania for the Second Continental Congress. Together they adopted a piece of legislation penned primarily by Virginian Thomas Jefferson. This piece of legislation decried tyranny, declared sovereignty, and established a nation. But every man knew that by affixing his name to the appendix of that document, he was committing an act of treason, punishable by death. But each individual signed it anyways, and the Declaration of Independence was born. Today, I believe that analyzing the U.S. Constitution, the most effective way to do so is by looking at the unwritten Constitution, which in fact are the principles behind the original doctrine. The Declaration of Independence is really the embodiment of those ideals, which range not only from natural rights, but also to the theory of government and the role of government embodied therein. Thomas Jefferson, the Declaration of Independence, in fact, outlines 18 different definitions, or grievances, against the King of England that defines what we know as tyranny. Now, in these definitions, one stands out to be particularly stark, where Jefferson writes that the king has set up many offices that send out many officials into society to drain the individuals of their substance. What we essentially see is that an over-regulatory policy in terms of the act of taking away property rights from individuals leads the government down a path to despotism, which is defined by the Founding Fathers as a system where the government controls the lives of the citizens to a dangerous degree. Now we also see therein that the Founding Fathers supported this idea of limited government. As James Madison writes stated on the floor of the House of Representatives in 1786, that the powers designated to the federal government are to be limited and very, very defined. That is to be contrasted with the powers to the states, which are to be vast and unlimited. What we essentially see here is that the Constitution itself guarantees specific reforms, as Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution designates. These are to be the 18 enumerated powers that the federal Congress is supposed to actually have and is supposed to actually utilize. When Congress steps outside of those 18 enumerated powers, they in turn try and stick a square peg in a round hole. It simply does not work. So essentially they're trying to use the wrong tool to solve a problem that it was never designed to do. You could think of it quite analogously that way. So whatever happens with that, did the founders support that idea? Thomas Jefferson in 1787, around the time of the ratification of the U.S. Constitution, stated that Congress should not have any and all powers that it may want to guarantee general welfare, rather only those specifically enumerated. Therefore, we see this is quite clear. The Founding Fathers wanted a government specifically defined to several enumerated powers. So, one of the biggest aspects of the Constitution, and the ideas circulating around the time of the American founding, was this concept of rule of law. Now, what rule of law basically is the idea that every individual, whether they work in government or whether they're a citizen of the country without working in government, works in the private sector rather, everybody is afforded the exact same protections under the law. In fact, etched in stone over the United States Supreme Court, we see the words equal justice under law. The reason we have that is because of a theory that was theorized by John Locke, something known as natural rights theory. Even Samuel Adams goes on to state that whether the individual is the countryman at the plow or the favorite of the clerk, he is to be equal under the justice of the law. What we essentially see is that government should treat everybody completely equally based on rights that are natural and alienable and given to us by God. What we can essentially take from that piece of information is this. Government cannot make laws that exempt certain individuals in government away from those laws. Rather, they can even not create laws that would exempt certain special groups of individuals either, because that's picking the winners and losers in a specific marketplace, which can lead to consequential ramifications when somebody is favored more than another. So our government was not crafted on those ideals, and when it strays to try and actualize those ideals, it generally goes down the road to an oligarchy, a society or country ruled by the very precious few. Now what we're going to be looking at additionally is this idea of natural rights, because when Thomas Jefferson crafted the Declaration, which James Madison borrowed heavily from to make his Constitution, we essentially find that John Locke, an individual in his 2 treatises of government, outlines the most premier and inalienable rights as life, liberty, and property. Thomas Jefferson borrows heavily and redefines property as pursuit of happiness. So now not only is property defined as the withholding of the actual property, but also the pursuit thereof, Now individuals are free to not only have property, but also free to work to the best of their physical means to achieve it. Locke writes in the 2 Treatises of Government that every individual's hands and body, the labor incurred thereby, should be his own profit, and no one else can take that away from him. What we can essentially see is that when an individual works, he should not be forced to give up any type of property for the good well-being of anyone else. However, if that individual wants to give that up, then they should be more than free to do so. We can talk about this in terms of incentives. If we take a look at modern welfare programs, we see this as quite stark. First of all, you can understand that if I have my money and I work a salary, and thereby I have earned that money, and I desire to give that to my friend Alec, then Alex is happy because he got the money, and I'm happy because I feel like it did something good. Now, if the federal government tells me that, Mr. Lane, you have to give your money to your friend Alec, then Alec believes he no longer has to work because he's going to get that money anyway. Whereas I believe I no longer have to work because I'm not going to keep my money anyway, rather it's just going to go to Alec. So when you think about this in concept, you see that the incentives are completely backwards. You want to have a government that encourages a free market economics, and by free market I mean a constitutional free market, which the founders envisioned as they talked about in the Northwest Ordinance of 1787, that the individual government should not interfere with private contracts between individuals. That's critical. If I want to make a deal with somebody, it's not the government's idea on whether or not how to regulate that in terms of what our agreement is set to be. That's stark. We look at the Constitution and specifically does not grant any authority for a Federal Reserve, Fannie Mae or Freddie Mac. The reason being is because in order to have equal opportunity, you have to have equal opportunity. And that in turn means government can't come forward and try and make these certain procedures that are going to equalize individuals, because those individuals will never feel totally equal because there's no common man understanding of equality. People will continue to fight for equality if governments continue to give it to them, even if equality has far since been surpassed. And that's not trying to look at any specific groups or anything, but if you think about it, that's the way humans are set up. That's the way human nature is to try and get more if it's in our self-interest. The Founding Fathers recognized that, and that's why they set up that free market of competition, so that the best product always comes forward when corporations compete with each other. So when you take a step back and look at that, we can also see something else that's very stark. That is the 10th Amendment to the United States Constitution, my personal favorite, which guarantees the rights to the states to actually be sovereign under the federal government. And in doing that, the states actually compete with each other to make policies effectively. What we essentially find here is that the states actually work best. If we take a look at Superstorm Sandy that just took place last year, the Federal Emergency Management Agency, again not included in the Constitution, told the governors of New York and New Jersey that they would take care of the problems that incurred thereby due to the national disaster, or natural disaster for that matter. What happened was that it took months for anything to ever happen, and those two states didn't have any backup reservoirs of funding. They couldn't expend any resources. People suffered dramatically. Whereas if you look in Louisiana, during the Gulf oil spill, the state itself actually had to clean up the beaches because the FEMA would not come down and do it in time. They cleaned the beaches up within a matter of weeks, whereas it took months to wait on the FEMA to actually come in and handle the issue at the federal level. When you take a step back, you see that universal programs, these one-size-fits-all ideals, that are not vested in the founders' intent of the original Constitution and of the original role of government, generally fall flat on their face. And the reason is because you're trying to stick that square peg in that round hole again, simply not going to be effective whatsoever. So today I encourage each of you to become informed on the Constitution. And by becoming informed, I don't mean to read textbooks. I mean to read the original Federalist Papers, the anti-Federalist Papers, and to look into the Constitution. For this is only an introductory talk about why it's critical we understand the Constitution and the founders' perspective of what it was. When we look at the entire perspective of the United States of America, we see that the Founding Fathers did in fact have the answers. It's just our duty to come forward, recognize, accept, and advance them. Thank you.